The scream pierced through the desolate wasteland like a knife through silk. In a place where temperatures rarely climbed above -40 and silence reigned supreme, any sound that wasn't the howling wind was an anomaly. Oren pulled his thermal hood tighter around his face, the frost-laden breath escaping his mask, crystallizing instantly in the brutal air. He had chosen this barren corner of the universe precisely because nothing happened here. Ira, they called it, a planet at the edge of known space where outcasts, fugitives, and the forgotten came to die or disappear. For 3 years, he had maintained his solitary existence in the prefabricated shelter he'd dragged piece by piece from his crashed ship, powered by salvage generators and warmed by makeshift heating units. His only company was guilt, pressing down on him like the perpetual weight of Ira's heavy atmosphere. The scream came again, weaker this time, but unmistakably human, or at least humanoid. Oren's scarred hands tightened on the scanner he'd been calibrating. He hadn't heard another voice in months, and even then, it had been nothing more than garbled transmissions from passing smugglers who had no interest in the frozen ghost that Ira represented. Just the wind, he muttered to himself, turning back to his work. Just the wind playing tricks. But it wasn't the wind. Deep in his bones, past the layers of thermal padding and cynicism, he knew it wasn't the wind. His mind flashed back to Vrexel border war, to the coordinates he'd miscalculated, to the civilians who had screamed just like this before the bombardment had silenced them forever. He'd spent 3 years telling himself he was done with the galaxy's suffering, done trying to play hero. The third scream made a move. Against every rational thought, against the survival instincts that had kept him alive in this frozen hell, Oren grabbed his emergency pack and headed into the storm. The wind attacked him the moment he stepped beyond his shelter's electromagnetic shield. Even with his military-grade thermal suit, the cold bit deep, finding every seam, every weakness. His boots crunched through the ice crust that covered the permafrost, each step requiring careful calculation to avoid the hidden crevasses that could swallow a manhole. The scream had come from the northeast, toward the ice fields where ancient mining equipment lay buried under centuries of snow. Oren checked his wrist-mounted navigation unit, the display flickering in the extreme cold. 2 kilometers, maybe 3. In this weather, it might as well have been a continent away. He found her 40 minutes later, though by then he could barely feel his face. She was small, smaller than any human he'd ever seen, with skin the color of burnished copper that seemed to shimmer even in the dim light filtering through the storm clouds. Her eyes, when they met his, were pure gold, wide with terror and pain. She was caught in a bear trap, or what passed for one on Ira. The rusted metal jaws had clamped down on her calf, the serrated teeth penetrating deep into flesh that was already turning blue from the cold. Blood had frozen around the wound, creating gruesome red crystals that glinted in the half-light. "Don't move," Oren said, holding up his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. She flinched away, pressing herself back against the ice wall behind her, making small, desperate sounds in her throat. He approached slowly, kneeling beside the trap. Up close, he could see the sophistication of its design. This wasn't some ancient mining equipment. This was a hunter's tool, placed deliberately, recently. Someone had set this trap for her specifically. Working the mechanism required removing his outer gloves, exposing his fingers to the killing cold for precious seconds at a time. The metal was frozen solid, the spring mechanism locked in place by ice and rust. He used his combat knife to chip away at the frozen blood, trying to create enough space to maneuver. The woman, alien, he corrected himself, noting the subtle differences in her bone structure, watched him with those golden eyes, her body trembling from cold and fear. Each time he tried to pry the jaws apart, she whimpered, a sound that cut through the wind like a physical thing. It took him 20 minutes to free her, 20 minutes during which he lost feeling in 3 fingers and she lost consciousness twice. When the trap finally released, blood began flowing again, dark and viscous in the extreme cold. Oren worked quickly, applying a pressure bandage from his kit and injecting her with a broad-spectrum antibiotic that he hoped would work on her physiology. She weighed almost nothing as he lifted her, her body limp in his arms. The journey back to his shelter was a blur of wind and snow, his muscles screaming with every step, his lungs burning from the frozen air. He spoke to her constantly, meaningless words of encouragement that were probably lost in the storm, but that gave him something to focus on besides the growing numbness in his extremities. When they finally reached his shelter, Oren had to use his shoulder to activate the entrance panel, his hands occupied with his unconscious burden. The warmth hit them like a wall, almost painful after the extreme cold. He carried her to his medical station, a corner of his living quarters that he'd equipped for emergencies, though he'd never expected to use it on anyone but himself. Working quickly, he cut away her strange clothing, a material that seemed to shift colors as it moved, and assessed her injuries. Besides the trap wound, she had numerous cuts and bruises, signs of a long pursuit across harsh terrain. Her vital signs were weak but stable, her breathing shallow but regular. He treated her wounds methodically, drawing on half-remembered medical training from his military days. The trap had done significant damage, but nothing that appeared immediately life-threatening if properly treated. As he worked, he noticed other things about her: the delicate bone structure, the slightly elongated fingers, the way her skin seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It was hours before she stirred, her golden eyes fluttering open to fix on his face with a mixture of fear and confusion. Oren had moved to his small kitchen area, preparing a simple broth that he hoped her system could handle. "Easy," he said softly as she tried to sit up, wincing at the pain in her leg. "You're safe now." She said something in a language he didn't recognize, her voice musical despite its weakness. When he shook his head, she tried again in broken galactic standard. "Not safe," she managed, her accent thick but understandable. "Never safe." Oren brought her the broth, supporting her head as she sipped it cautiously. "Who's hunting you?" She looked at him for a long moment, seemingly weighing how much to trust this stranger who had pulled her from the ice. Finally, she spoke a single word: "Cleaners." Oren's blood ran cold. He knew that term. The Cleaners were a semi-mythical group, supposedly sanctioned by various governments to handle problems that couldn't be addressed through official channels. If they were after her, she must have seriously angered someone in power. "I'm Oren," he said, changing the subject. "What's your name?" "Darren," she replied, her voice stronger now. "Darren of the Kai-Shun." Over the next several hours, as the storm raged outside, Darren's story emerged in fragments. She came from a highly structured society where marriages were arranged for political and genetic purposes. She had committed the unforgivable sin of falling in love with someone outside her assigned match, someone considered genetically inferior by her people's standards. When her transgression was discovered, the council had given her a choice: submit to genetic recalibration and marry her assigned partner, or face exile. She had chosen exile, but apparently that wasn't enough for them. They had sent the Cleaners to ensure she never had the chance to return or spread her contaminated ideas to others. "Ira was supposed to be my prison," she explained, her golden eyes distant. "A frozen tomb where I would die slowly, forgotten. But they didn't trust even that. They want me erased completely." Oren listened, his own guilt stirring as she spoke of impossible choices and the price of defiance. He found himself sharing his own story: the miscalculation during the Vrexel border war, the civilian casualties that haunted his dreams, his self-imposed exile to this frozen world. "We're both running from our past," Darren observed, her hand finding his across the small table. Her touch was surprisingly warm, her skin smooth despite the ordeal she'd endured. Their moment of connection was shattered by an alarm from Oren's perimeter sensors. Someone was approaching the shelter, moving with purpose through the storm. "They've found me," Darren whispered, her face draining of color. Oren moved quickly to his security console, pulling up the external cameras. 3 figures in advanced thermal gear were making their way across the ice field, their movements precise and coordinated. "Military training," he noted. "Professional." "Can you walk?" he asked Darren, already knowing the answer. She tried to stand, but her injured leg buckled immediately. Oren caught her before she fell, supporting her weight easily. "There's an emergency exit," he said, moving toward a concealed panel in the back wall. "Leads to a series of ice caves. We can lose them there." But even as he spoke, he knew it was futile. Darren couldn't travel far in her condition, and the cleaners would have thermal scanners that could track them through the caves. They needed another plan. "No more running," Darren said, echoing his thoughts. Her golden eyes met his with surprising determination. "I choose to fight." Oren hesitated for only a moment, before nodding. "Then we fight together." He helped her to his weapons locker, a remnant of his military past that he'd hoped never to open again. Inside were enough supplies to equip a small squad, pulse rifles, thermal detonators, and most importantly, anti-personnel mines. "There's an abandoned mining complex 2 kilometers east," he explained, pulling out equipment. "Honeycomb of tunnels, unstable supports. If we can lure them there, we can bring it down on their heads," Darren finished, a fierce smile crossing her face. They worked quickly, Oren rigging a false trail that would lead the cleaners away from the shelter and toward the mining complex. He set up remote detonators throughout the tunnel system, placing charges at key structural points. Darren, despite her injury, proved surprisingly adept with technology, helping him calibrate the explosives for maximum effect. The journey to the complex was grueling. Oren half-carried Darren through the storm, both of them fighting against wind that seemed determined to push them back. The cleaners were good. They'd already discovered the deception and adjusted their pursuit. Oren could see their lights in the distance, gaining ground steadily. They reached the mine entrance just as the first shots rang out, energy bolts sizzling through the frozen air. Oren returned fire, giving Darren time to activate the first set of charges. The explosion sent a shower of ice and rock into the air, temporarily obscuring them from view. Inside the mine, the temperature dropped even further. Ancient equipment lay scattered throughout the tunnels, covered in thick layers of frost. Their footsteps echoed off the walls as they moved deeper into the complex, laying their trap. The cleaners entered the mine with professional caution, sweeping each tunnel with military precision. Oren and Darren retreated slowly, allowing themselves to be herded toward the central chamber where they'd placed the main charges. "Now," Darren whispered as they reached their predetermined position. "Not yet," Oren replied, watching the cleaners approach through a small periscope he'd rigged. "Let them commit fully." The next few minutes were an agonizing game of cat and mouse. The cleaners advanced methodically, checking every shadow, every alcove. Oren could hear their radio chatter, professional and emotionless. They were discussing the bonus they'd receive for confirming Darren's termination. When all 3 cleaners had entered the kill zone, Oren gave the signal. Darren pressed the detonator with trembling fingers. The initial explosion was smaller than expected, just enough to destabilize the main support beams. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like thunder, the ceiling began to collapse. Tons of ice and rock cascaded down, filling the tunnel with choking dust and debris. The cleaners' radio chatter turned to screams, quickly silenced by the crushing weight of the mountain above them. Oren and Darren ran for the emergency exit they'd identified earlier, the entire complex shaking around them. Chunks of ice fell from the ceiling, narrowly missing them as they sprinted, or in Darren's case, hobbled through the collapsing tunnels. They burst out into the open air just as the final section gave way, the entrance ceiling behind them with a definitive crash. For several moments, they lay in the snow, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling from exertion and adrenaline. "It's over," Oren said finally, helping Darren to her feet. She leaned against him, her golden eyes scanning the horizon. "For now, there will be others. Then we'll face them together." They made their way back to the shelter, the storm finally beginning to abate. Inside, they tended to their wounds and shared a meal in companionable silence. The reality of what they'd done and what it meant for their future hung between them like a physical presence. That night, as Oren checked the perimeter sensors one last time, he found Darren standing by the observation window, looking out at the frozen landscape. "I never thanked you," she said softly. For saving me. You saved yourself, he replied, moving to stand beside her. I just helped a little. She turned to face him, her golden eyes reflecting the dim emergency lighting. Why did you? You could have left me there. It would have been safer. Oren considered the question, thinking of all the reasons he could give: guilt, loneliness, simple human decency. In the end, he settled for the truth. Because I couldn't live with myself if I hadn't tried. Darren nodded, understanding in her expression. She reached up, her fingers tracing the scar that ran along his jaw. We're alike, you and I, both carrying wounds that won't heal. Maybe they can, he said softly. Maybe we can heal each other. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered without words. In that moment, something shifted between them, a connection, forged in ice and fire, in shared danger and mutual understanding. Over the next several weeks, they worked to fortify the shelter, turning it from a hiding place into a home. Oren taught Darren about Earth technology, while she shared the advanced scientific knowledge of her people. Together, they built a hydroponic garden, using salvaged equipment to create a small oasis of green in their frozen world. Darren's leg healed slowly but surely, though she would always carry a slight limp as a reminder of her ordeal. She adapted to life on Ira with remarkable resilience, her natural grace returning as her strength improved. They developed a routine, checking sensors, maintaining equipment, tending to their small garden. In the evenings, they would sit together, sharing stories of their respective worlds, planning for a future that seemed increasingly possible. One rare clear day, when Ira's sun managed to break through the perpetual cloud cover, they ventured outside together. The landscape, usually so hostile, seemed almost beautiful in the golden light. Ice crystals sparkled like diamonds, and the air, while still brutally cold, felt clean and pure. Do you regret it? Oren asked as they stood on a ridge overlooking their valley. Choosing exile over submission? Darren considered the question, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. I regret the pain I've caused others. My family, my intended mate, they didn't ask for this scandal. But I don't regret choosing love over duty. And now, he gestured at the frozen wasteland around them. This isn't exactly paradise. She smiled, taking his hand in hers. Paradise is relative. I have freedom here, and I have you. That's more than I ever hoped for. They returned to the shelter as the brief daylight faded, the temperature dropping rapidly. Inside, they prepared a meal from their limited supplies, supplemented by the first harvest from their hydroponic garden, a small triumph that felt like a major victory. That night, as they lay together in the small bed they now shared, Darren spoke of the future. They'll send more cleaners eventually, she said, her head resting on his chest. Or worse. Let them come, Oren replied, his arms tightening around her. We'll be ready. You're not afraid? Terrified, he admitted. But I'm more afraid of losing this, losing you, than I am of fighting. She raised herself up on one elbow, looking down at him with those remarkable golden eyes. Then we build something worth fighting for. Not just a shelter, but a life. A future. Over the following months, they did exactly that. They expanded their living space, carving additional rooms out of the ice and rock. They improved their defenses, setting up an early warning system that would give them hours of notice before any approaching threat. Most importantly, they built a relationship based on trust, respect, and growing love. Their differences, cultural, biological, experiential, became strengths rather than obstacles. Oren's military training complemented Darren's scientific knowledge. His pragmatism balanced her idealism. They faced challenges, of course. Supply runs to abandoned outposts were dangerous affairs, requiring careful planning and execution. Equipment failures in a harsh environment were common, testing their ingenuity and resourcefulness. And always, there was the specter of discovery, the knowledge that their peace could be shattered at any moment. But they persevered, finding joy in small victories and comfort in each other's presence. They celebrated holidays from both their cultures, creating new traditions that belonged solely to them. They made plans for expansion, discussing the possibility of reaching out to other exiles, creating a community of outcasts on this frozen world. One morning, almost a year after their first meeting, Oren woke to find Darren already up, standing at their observation window. The storm season had passed, and the landscape outside was bathed in the pale light of Ira's twin moons. "What do you see?" he asked, joining her at the window. "Possibilities," she replied, leaning back against him. "A future we couldn't have imagined when we first met." He wrapped his arms around her, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Any regrets?" "Only that we didn't find each other sooner." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as the first rays of sunlight began to paint the ice fields in shades of pink and gold. It was a new day on Ira, full of challenges and opportunities, dangers and wonders. Whatever came next, more cleaners, supply shortages, the harsh realities of life on a frozen world, they would face it together. They had built something precious in this desolate place. A home, a partnership, a love that defied the conventions of two different cultures. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the ice, Oren and Darren began their daily routine, moving in perfect synchronization born of practice and mutual understanding. They checked sensors, tended to their garden, maintained their equipment, all the mundane tasks that had become the foundation of their shared life. And in the quiet moments between tasks, they would catch each other's eye and smile, sharing a silent acknowledgement of the miracle they had created together. They had both been sent to Ira to disappear, to be forgotten by their respective societies. Instead, they had found each other, and in doing so had discovered a reason to live, to fight, to hope. The future remained uncertain, filled with potential threats and unknown challenges. But as they faced another day on their frozen world, Oren and Darren knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever came their way, they would face it together, united by a love that had bloomed in the most unlikely of places. In the vast, indifferent universe, on a planet meant for exile and death, they had created their own small paradise. And that, they both knew, was worth any price they might have to pay.